Tariffs. We hear that word all the time, right? Splashed across headlines, usually tied to some big trade war or economic policy debate. But it's so much more than just a political chess piece. We're talking about a hidden tax, one that has very real, tangible consequences for businesses, for farmers, and yeah, for you and me. So let's really get into it.
And really, it all boils down to this one huge question. When a country decides to slap a tariff on goods coming in, who really pays for it? Is it the foreign company that made the stuff? Or is it someone else? Let's dig in and find the answer.
Okay, so first things first. Before we go any further, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. What is a tariff really, and how do economists look at it? On the surface, it's a pretty simple idea, but trust me, the ripple effects are anything but simple.
I love this analogy from the Hoover Institution. It's such a brilliant way to think about it. Imagine that international trade is like this amazing new technology, a brand new machine that lets us produce everything way more efficiently. A tariff, then? Well, it's basically a tax you have to pay every single time you want to use that incredible machine. It just gums up the works, right? It slows the whole thing down and makes everything cost more.
All right, so here's the more, textbook definition. A tariff is just a tax paid on stuff coming in or going out of a country. But the most important part of that definition, the real kicker, is that it distorts the prices. What that means is it messes with the natural flow of the market. It creates this artificial cost that doesn't just disappear. Someone, somewhere, has to eat that cost.
And that leads us to a really crucial trade-off. See, with tariffs, there are always winners and losers. It's not a win-win. They're usually put in place to shield certain industries at home, to protect them. But what we're seeing from all the recent data is pretty darn clear. That cost, it gets passed along. And guess who ends up paying? Yep, domestic consumers and importers. They're the ones who ultimately bear the burden.
For the longest time, we're talking decades, the story of tariffs here in the US was pretty straightforward. They were going down, down, down. But that long, predictable story, it just took a massive, historic turn. Okay, just look at this chart. This is wild. It shows the average US tariff rate going all the way back to 1790. And you can see it, for over 70 years, it's just this steady march downward, hitting these incredibly low levels, and then bam! Look at the very, very end of that line. It's not just a little bump, it's an almost vertical spike, a complete reversal of decades and decades of policy in the blink of an eye.
So just how big is that spike we're talking about? Well, as of August 2025, the average effective tariff rate in the U.S. shot up to 17.9%. Now, to give you some context for that number, that is the highest it has been in almost 90 years. 90! It's a huge deal.
Okay, so we've seen the big picture, this massive policy shift. But what does that actually look like on the ground? What are the real-world consequences? Let's zoom right in on a perfect, high-stakes example that really shows the domino effect of a trade war, the big agricultural standoff between the US and China.
So this whole thing kicked off back in 2018. But if you look at the chart, you can see where things just went into overdrive, right there in 2025. That red line climbing? That's the US tariffs on Chinese goods. And the blue line shooting up right alongside it? That's China's response, tariffs on US exports. I mean, it's the very definition of a tit-for-tat trade war. And let me tell you, China's response was surgical. It was incredibly targeted. Just look at this table. You can see the tariffs they slapped on key US farm products. I mean, check out pork, a 56% tariff. That's huge. But the real bullseye, the biggest target by a country mile, was soybeans. We're talking about a market worth more than $15 billion a year.
And here's what happened next. Honestly, this is one of the most powerful pictures of what we call trade diversion that I think I've ever seen. On the left, you've got U.S. soybean exports to China. See that red line? It just falls off a cliff. It absolutely craters. And then look at the chart on the right. That's Brazil's soybean exports to China, also in red, rocketing upwards to fill the exact gap that the U.S. just created.
And if you want to see the long-term fallout, this chart says it all. The orange line is Brazil, the red line is the U.S. You can pinpoint the exact moment the trade war really heats up, because that's when the lines cross. And it's not a temporary blip. Brazil decisively overtakes the U.S., and this could be a fundamental, maybe even permanent shift in who supplies the world's biggest market.
So yeah, the soybean story is just a perfect little microcosm of what happens. But of course, none of this happens in a vacuum, right? These actions have massive global ripples. So let's zoom back out now and take a look at the global price tag for all this instability.
Wow. Okay, if you ever wanted to see what pure economic chaos looks like on a chart, this is it. This is the Global Trade Policy Uncertainty Index. Basically, it tracks how much the world is worrying and talking about trade uncertainty. And for decades, it was pretty stable, pretty boring. But then, look at 2025. That isn't a spike, that's a rocket launch into completely uncharted space. It just shows you how profoundly these policies have shaken business confidence all around the globe.
And it's not just economic uncertainty. That's being matched by legal uncertainty, too. The whole legal basis for these tariffs is being fought out in the courts right now. As you can see on this timeline, lower courts have already ruled against the way they were justified, and now the whole thing is on a collision course with the Supreme Court for a final showdown. So let's just connect all the dots here, right? These tariffs set off a massive chain reaction. First, consumers like you and me, we face higher prices. Then, global supply chains get thrown into total chaos. It's this expensive, complicated mess as companies desperately try to find new suppliers. And our farmers, they get hit from two sides. First with retaliatory tariffs on the stuff they're trying to sell overseas, and then again with higher costs for things like machinery they need to buy. It's really a battle on multiple economic fronts.
And what's the bottom line? What's the final price tag for the whole globe? Well, the World Trade Organization basically took a giant red pen to its global trade forecast for 2026. They've slashed it down to just 0.5%. That is a massive slowdown. It's one clear, stark number that shows the drag these policies are putting on the entire world economy. And that brings us right back to where we started. Tariffs, as we've seen, are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They literally shift fortunes. They redraw the maps of global trade. They inject massive instability into the system. And all of that leaves us with one final and I think really crucial question to ponder. When trade is turned into a weapon, who's really left to pick up all the pieces?